to say, not ye, should be ashamed in this same confident boasting. Therefore, I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren that they would go before unto you and make up beforehand of your bounty, whereof ye have had notice before, that the same might be ready as a matter of bounty and not of covetousness. Now, he's still in the middle of this conversation about giving, and he's exhorting them, but I wanted you to notice something about the heart of Paul. Paul is essentially saying here, I'm really thinking of three different parties all at the same time. I'm thinking of the Macedonian brethren when we went to them and they asked us, what is this thing about giving? How does that work? And I boasted of you to them because you told me when I was there last year and I saw you, you told me you guys were going to really give offerings and you were going to relieve the suffering of the saints in Jerusalem, and you were very heartfelt and sincere in it. And so I told them they don't need to worry because you would have it covered. And yet they decided that you shouldn't carry that burden all by yourself. They should give as well. And so they did. But they gave not of their bounty, but rather out of their poverty they gave. So he's thinking of the Macedonians and he's thinking of the Corinthians. He doesn't want the Macedonians to get there and suddenly become discouraged because this big wealthy church, the Corinthian church, turns out didn't give anything or didn't give much. And they had given out of their poverty and necessity. And so he didn't want the Macedonians to be discouraged. He didn't want the Corinthians to be embarrassed. And he didn't want those of his own party to be ashamed. So there's kind of three emotions there that he's playing on. This discouragement on one side, embarrassment on another, and his party and their shame that they might feel if they had told everybody the Corinthian church is going to do this. They're taking that burden on themselves so you don't have to. But then they get to the Corinthian church and find out the Corinthian church didn't take that burden on. So he's actually revealing to you how he's thinking through this process and the parties involved. And he's telling you, I thought, therefore, my solution to this. In my thought, the right answer for this wasn't for me to come to you directly. Instead, the right answer was for me to send a bunch of younger, faster traveling brothers to go ahead of us so they could let you know all of this and get you ready. And that way, when we showed up, all three parties would be happy about it. The Macedonians wouldn't know that you'd taken time to get ready. They would assume that you had already been prepared. I would get there and my party would not be ashamed because we had boasted of you and it turned out that you met that standard. And you would not be embarrassed because suddenly people showed up saying, where's this bounty you spoke of? And there was none there, right? So he's thinking of all three parties at the same time. That's not easy. If you've ever been in a leadership position, and if you're a parent, you've been in a leadership position, and if you're a parent of two or more children, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's oftentimes like, well, let me put it this way. I'll give you an illustration. In my house growing up, there were 4 teenage boys all at the same time, which meant when dinner was put on the table at 5 p.m., nobody was going to tell you it was dinner time. There was no bell to ring. There was none of that. If you didn't show up at the table, that's your fault. And if you showed up at 5:15, all of your favorite food might already have been eaten by your siblings, and you were going to eat whatever was left. And nobody was going to feel sorry for you. That's your fault because you're the one who's responsible for being at this table at 5 o'clock, and if you're not here, tough luck. You get leftovers. If there are any. You understand? Paul's saying, I didn't want to be that way with you. I wanted to protect the interest of all three parties. It's it's so easy for us in a leadership position to say we're going to sacrifice the interest of these parties so that we can push ahead with this agenda. But Paul here is saying my process wasn't that way. My thought process was to try to protect the interest of all three parties. And so I thought I would send these brothers on ahead so that you would be prepared and everybody's interest would be protected in this thing. It takes a lot of thought energy to figure out a solution like that. And Paul said he had done it that way, and he put it there so we could see how he thinks about it. And we should think the same way. We should try as hard as possible to protect the interest of the people around us, and that is not necessarily natural. Our natural thing is to sacrifice the interest of some people, even to deliberately injure them, if you will, right? Especially people we disagree with, especially people we think should know better, right? And we would just almost roughshod over them, right? And I know I'm sort of picking here, and I don't mean to cause injury, but there is that idea that we often hear of, you know, if you really want to make it around here, you've got to have a thick skin. But that isn't really the way it ought to be. The way it really ought to be is that we here protect one another's interests. And we safeguard one another's needs. We respect that other people may have a different interest in this church and in their life than what we do. And we try hard to think of a way to protect all of those interests. That may not always be possible. But there's a very big difference between riding roughshod over some people's interests, like putting some people's interests to sacrifice so that we can meet a greater need. And say, well, those people are just going to suffer because we've got to go here and do this, right? And I can very easily see Paul having thought that. I've got to make it to Jerusalem by a certain time. I'm taking whatever offerings I've got. If they're ready, they're ready. And if not, I'll be embarrassed. The Macedonians will be discouraged. And the Corinthians will be embarrassed over it. And that's just how it's going to be. And he didn't want that to be that way. Okay. So leadership lessons in how to think as a leader. Now we're going to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 10. And this entire chapter almost is about thinking and the thought process. So we're going to kind of read through it and make some observations as we go. Now I, Paul, myself beseech you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am base among you, but being absent am bold toward you. Now, this is a different way than we are. I just want to know, I want you to see how Paul's thinking process is so much different than ours. Right? What we would do is we would tend to be bold toward people in person. But then when we can get it in writing, we'll edit it 5 times, pull out the emotion, have somebody look over the words for us so that we don't come across so strongly in writing. But when we're with somebody, we tend to be, it tends to be easier for us to be gruff, right? Paul said he was exactly the opposite of that. That he had instead adopted this meekness of Christ so that when he was with them in person, he was very tender with them. But when he was absent, he would write to them very plainly and be very bold about it. Right? He wasn't ashamed to put those things into writing that would be very easy for people to understand, even if it sort of cut a little bit in the process. They would have it in writing, they would see it, because in his presence, he had been so tender that they would project some of that tenderness on his writings, and in his writings he could be bold. All right, so that's his lead into this, and he's going to give this lead in. You might say, I wonder why he starts this chapter with that statement. And the answer is he's probably going to say some pretty bold things because he's writing here. And he wants to remind them, I'm really sweet when I'm with you. I'm really tender with you when we're together. So remember that now when you read what I'm about to tell you. Because this is going to hurt just a little bit, but I need to put it in writing so you got it clear and you can read it over and over and over again and you can iron out the misunderstandings. So get ready because this is going to come in hard. Right? This is kind of what he's saying here. Then he says, I beseech you that I may not be bold when I am present with that confidence wherewith I think to be bold against some, which think of us as if we walked according to the flesh. Now he's his kind of give the paraphrase of this. He's saying, I'm getting reports that some of you are talking about us like we're, I don't know, getting rich off this ministry. Like we just want to be in charge of something, and so we have this ministry so we can be in charge of it. Or whatever it is that you guys think we're walking according to the flesh. And I have some really good answers for that. And if I hit you with those answers in person, you're going to feel like I'm the logic bully, driving the point home in front of everybody. I don't want to be that way. I could, but I don't want to. I would rather it be that I could come to you and be soft and tender in presence. So I'm writing this to you who think we walk according to the flesh. Now here's that great verse that people tend to take out of context a lot, right? So here's a verse to take out of context. For we walk in the flesh, for though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. Casting down imaginations at every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ, and having in a readiness to revenge all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. Whew. It's nice to pull out this little part in the middle about casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and just kind of and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. Pull that out of context and sort of miss what he's saying here, because what he's saying here isn't, and maybe we should take it this way, this is the way we should live. I agree we should be that way, but I want you to notice this context is that's the way he and his party are walking. He and his party are walking in the following way. Let's take it apart a little bit at a time. He says, they think we walk according to the flesh. Some of you are thinking that I'm walking according to the flesh. That I'm like out here, I don't have a family to worry about. I travel in tents. It's like I'm in a constant camping expedition, right? I'm out here traveling from city to city. I preach until I get people mad at me, and then I move on. I don't want to stay there and fight that battle. I leave behind some Christians there who will fight that battle after I leave. You guys are looking at this as though I were somehow being weak, as though I were living in the flesh. And I want you to know, I'm not doing that. I'm walking by faith, right? Although I walk in the flesh, I don't war after the flesh. I'm not there to create more problems for, say, the Macedonians. When persecution rises up in Macedonia and they want to kick me out, I leave. Why? Because I'm not at all trying to make life hard for the Macedonian brethren. That is not my purpose. I'm not warring after the flesh. I'm not going before the city councils and the magistrates and trying to make life better for the Macedonian Christians. That is not what I'm doing. Now, just in case you think I'm making political commentary on America, I'm not. Telling you that's what Paul said about his ministry. We should be a people who involves ourselves to the point where we at least understand the issues of our day and can vote intelligently on them. And we should be a people who go out and vote, right? We should not be a people who run away from society. The church has done that for too long. We need to involve ourselves in the workings of the society in which God has placed us, and we need to be active citizens. Paul was not that. He was an itinerant preacher. He was an evangelist traveling and preaching the gospel, and since he was doing that, he was a lightning rod for an immense amount of political anger. And instead of staying around to make things angry and fighting a battle against politics, he would leave, let things cool down, let the gospel spread in that town, and let that society be changed one soul at a time. That was his goal. And so he's telling them, we don't walk according to the flesh. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal. I am not doing all that stuff. You ought to have some carnal weapons. And I'm not talking about guns and knives and brass knuckles. I mean, you ought to have your brain educated well to make strong arguments and take political stands on the things that are important. Those would be carnal weapons. And you should have some of those. Paul wasn't going to take that path. He was not called into that service. You are. So he says, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations, and every high thing that exalteth itself against God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. Those are mighty words. And I have heard that verse interpreted probably a dozen different ways. Almost never have I heard it interpreted in context. So I want you to think about it in context today. Can someone tell me what you think Paul is saying in that verse? Don't personalize it. Don't make a personal application to yourself. Tell me what he's saying in the verse. First of all, you'll notice it's personal to him. Right? It might help to know this is the end of a paragraph. Right? It is a form of conclusion. He's concluding the paragraph out with this thought. In the beginning of the paragraph, he tells them, there's some among you who think we're living in the flesh. And so he's making an argument here that this is not living in the flesh. And he's saying, I can sort of prove to you that we're not living in the flesh. I don't see a lot of people jumping up, so let's walk through this. I understand why you have a challenge with this passage. Because it's been quoted and preached so often as an application that in many of our minds it has completely lost the actual meaning of the passage. We think of it sort of as an outward action, right? We have these weapons and we go out into society, and with these weapons, these spiritual weapons we have, we pull down the strongholds of the devil in the city of San Antonio. And we cast down all the idols and the imaginations and anything that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. We begin to purge from our society, and we show people the true way. Makes a great sermon, has absolutely nothing to do with the verse. Yes.
The only thing I can that I understand from it is like Paul's saying that he's going to cast aside any thoughts that don't bring him to obey Christ, and things that go against what he knows to be the truth. That's kind of what I understand.
Yes. So let's think of it this way. This is Paul's outline of the discipline he and those who travel with him maintain for themselves in themselves. He's not talking about the idols out in the world. He's not talking about the political imaginations. He's not talking about the imaginations of false religion. He's talking about the imaginations in his own head and heart. He's talking not about everybody else's thoughts that aren't in alignment with God. He's talking about his own thoughts. When he says, we don't walk like that, we walk after the Spirit with these weapons that we have, these spiritual weapons, aren't weapons we're wielding against everybody else. They're weapons we're wielding against our own heart and mind, pulling down our own imaginations, our own thoughts that exalt themselves against God. Because it's a constant struggle, it's a constant discipline. And you know it is. Consider this. Paul says, when he talks to the Philippians, he says, I know both how to be abased and how to abound, everywhere in all things. I've been taught this lesson. I know this. I can get along when I don't have anything, not even necessary food. And I can get along when I receive a big blessing from one of the churches, because I can abound. How is it that you can get along just as well in necessity as you can in abundance? And when we're all sitting here and our bellies are full and everything is fine, it's sort of easy for us to imagine how we might get along in both necessity and abundance. But when you're walking through it, that's different. Now you need discipline so that you keep yourself free from this entanglement. Now, we ought to take that as a lesson. If we want to make an application of this, let's make the application at least by the context. And let's say we should have a discipline in ourselves of looking at our thoughts and judging them, looking at our imaginations and passing judgment on them, and bringing them into captivity in our own heart and mind. We live in a world that tells us our emotions are valid and our thoughts are valid. What Paul is saying is, I don't assume that what I'm thinking and feeling is valid. Sometimes I judge it as invalid, wrong. Now that's tough. When you're feeling sad about something and you look at yourself and say, I don't have any right to feel sad about this. I am wrong in feeling sad about this. That's one thing. That's half the battle. The other half of the battle is now to bring that feeling into captivity to Christ. And if you want to see a real battle, the real battles aren't out there in society where everybody is spouting off all sorts of crazy stuff. The real battle is inside you where you're spouting off all sorts of crazy stuff. And bringing in your own emotions to captivity to Christ, that is not simple. And that's why this verse doesn't get preached in context very often. Because it's hard for us to align our thinking this way. Okay? Let's get back on here. So he says, but he doesn't finish there. He finishes with this statement, and having in a readiness to revenge all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. In other words, I'm willing to put this in action among you. When I can see that you're ready. When you guys have shown me that you're obedient and you've got your heads together, well, then, I'm willing to come in, pass some judgment, straighten out some people's thinking, and get everybody's emotion in the right place. But I'm not going to do that if you're not going to be obedient. Because I'm not just going to come in and browbeat you or strong arm you into obedience or somehow manipulate you into obeying Christ. I don't do that to myself, and I'm not going to do it to you. I carefully judge my thinking and my feeling, and I carefully bring it into captivity, and I align it to God. And when I see that you're willing to be obedient, then I will come in and help you get there. But not until then. And that tells me that there are some things that you don't have today because you're not ready for them. You're struggling with some battles today that you shouldn't struggle with. And the reason you're struggling with those battles is because you haven't addressed the primary issue at the bottom of it, which is you allow yourself to think a set of thoughts that you shouldn't be thinking. And you have to stop yourself from thinking those thoughts. So, well, that's easier said than done. No kidding. Why do you think he uses those kind of words? Captivity. Why do you think he uses that? Because it's not easy. It means you actually have to think a little bit ahead of time and say, when I start thinking this thought, I'm going to say these words to myself. I'm going to think these thoughts. I'm going to pray this way. I'm going to do this. You have to have your plan written out. You have to have a discipline around it. And then you actually have to monitor your thoughts so that when you start thinking that way, and when you start thinking that way, your own heart's going to say, yeah, but you justified this time. You're in the right. And you have to look at it and say, no, I actually have to judge my own feelings and my imaginations that exalt themselves against Christ because I know what the truth is, and that thought isn't the truth. Even if I'm right in thinking it, it's still the wrong thought. Even if I am hurt and I have been injured, that's still the wrong thought. And it's so much easier just to let your thoughts go than it is to actually discipline your thinking process. Do ye look on things after the outward appearance? If any man trust to himself that he is Christ, let him of himself think this again, that as he is Christ, so are we Christ's. For though I should boast somewhat more of our authority, which the Lord hath given us for edification, that is, building up other people, the right use of leadership, the right use of power is to build up other people. But that's not the big lesson here. The big lesson is you need to change what you think about others. You need to change what you think about others because you are a. Here's the funny thing. You're a better judge of yourself than you are of others, but you judge others more than you judge yourself. Now, you may not be that great a judge of yourself, but you're a better judge of yourself than you are others. And the more you judge yourself, the better you get at that job. But it's so much easier for us to judge others. Just go to Facebook and read the posts about any president that's in power at the time. Doesn't matter. Just go to Facebook and you will see the judgment. But how many people are judging themselves now? And if you do, you're not posting it. See, it's so much easier to do the other. He says, we could boast of our authority. And if we did, you know what? That wouldn't be good. The Lord gave us that authority for edification of others and not for your destruction. I should not be ashamed. God gave me this authority so that I could build you up and make you stronger. He didn't give me this authority so that I could somehow make you I could destroy you with this authority. I could injure you with it. But I'm not going to do that, he said, because I don't want to be ashamed by what I do. That I may not seem as if I would terrify you by letters. For his letters, say they, are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech is contemptible. Or another way to look at that would be common. His speech is base. He doesn't use very many big words. He doesn't he doesn't he has all these. When you read Romans, you're reading thoughts that were distilled. I often wonder when I read Romans, I wonder how many copies did he throw away before he finally said this is the one to send, right? Because when you read that thing, it is an amazing amount of thought and analysis that is in a really small space. He made a bunch of draft copies before he sent it. And then when he sends it, almost every word out of it comes across with a punch. So his letters are weighty. But when he's with you, he's speaking all these words of kindness and tenderness and sweetness. His bodily presence is weak and his speech is contemptible. There's nothing admirable in his words when he's there. It's almost like you're looking at two different versions of Paul. One when he's standing in front of you, and one when he's writing you a letter. And he's saying, I do that on purpose. It's not an accident. I do it deliberately. Why? Lest such a one think this, that such as we are in word by letters when we are absent, such will we be also indeed when we are present. I don't ever want to be that way with you face to face. Now, this is an absolutely brilliant example in leadership. Brilliant. Paul is essentially saying, I don't want to come in and make myself like the supreme leader in your midst. I don't want to do that. I'll write these letters because when I send them, your elders are going to be the ones reading them to you, not me. And therefore, that authority will not usurp the authority of those elders. They will still stand as leaders among you. I don't want to come to you and be that way. So if you know people who would prefer to be that way in person, may I suggest it's not a good example of leadership. Paul specifically says, I don't do that. I don't want to be embarrassed. I don't want to hurt you. I wasn't given this power to hurt you. I was given this power to edify you. Now, I know there are some people who would say, well, I edify people like a drill sergeant does. A drill sergeant builds you up, and that's the way I am. You mangy maggots, get in line. Give me 100. Yeah, a drill sergeant does work that way. And Paul could have worked that way. I had a drill sergeant when I was in the Army, when I was in basic training. I met him again 3 years later. He was out serving in a unit, and he drove by in a Jeep, and I didn't recognize him, but he recognized me. And the Jeep drove by and slammed on the wheels, and slammed and the tires in the gravel just. And I thought, oh no, what did I do this time, right? Because I was always in trouble. And I turned around, and there's Drill Sergeant Nerlin. And I said, Sergeant Nerlin. And he said, hey, how you doing? I've always wondered what happened to you. How's your Army career going? I said, well, it's going to be over here in just a few months. I'm a short timer now. He said, I knew you wouldn't make 2 turns. And I said, really? What made you think that? He said, you have this annoying habit of thinking that you have a right to think. And that is not what we need of you. We need you to obey without thinking. And you're never going to fit that mold. And that's okay. It's good. Not everybody needs to be that way. And I was thinking, is this really the drill sergeant I knew in basic training who called me a maggot? Really? Is this the same guy? Yes. Sometimes you need a drill sergeant like that. It's really good for you every now and then. But they're not really great leaders in that way. They're better leaders when they show you they care. You want to follow a leader who actually does care about you that way. And you need to lead other people that way. When I was in the Boy Scouts many, many years ago, we went on a canoe trip on the Au River in Michigan. In the spring, it was the coldest canoe trip we ever had. I got frostbite on my fingers that year. And I was with one of the leaders, and he said, I want you to learn to take the stern. I'll take the bow this time. I said, okay. So we get in, he starts paddling, and I stick my paddle in, and I use it like a rudder. And I'm steering the canoe, right? And we got about 300 yards down that river. He goes, what are you doing back there? I'm working way too hard up here. And I was like, I don't know, I'm just steering us, right? And he looks back and he goes, that is not how you do that. He said, what you need to do is you need to paddle on the opposite side you want us to go to, right? So if you want us to go left, starboard, paddle on the port side. That'll get us to go the other way. I was like, you mean the guy in the back has to paddle? I thought I was just guiding us. He goes, oh no, you're working harder than me. That's why you're back there. Now I understand. You see, you want a leader. You don't want the one who's just the rudder in the water, steering you whichever way he wants you to go, making you do all the work. You want the one who's working hard to make sure things are going in the right direction. That's what Paul was saying. He could have given up. Look at all he's going through just to make sure things are going in the right direction. He's monitoring his own thoughts, his own emotions. He's passing judgment on them. He's wrestling them. He's getting them in line with Christ. He's putting himself in submission constantly to Jesus Christ because he's not walking according to the flesh. And he's out there doing this constantly for these people. When he's with them and he thinks, boy, I could let them have it. I could let them know what was right, and I could give them direct instruction on how this should go. He holds it back, and he waits, and he gives them an opportunity, and he waits until he's gone, and he doesn't write the next morning. It's not like, okay, I'm 20 miles from town. I'm going to write this letter and send it back with a runner. No, he gives it a little time and space. Then he writes them a letter, and it's very clear and blunt, and he lays it out, but he's getting reports, and he's making sure, and he doesn't want to over-control. This is not a cult. He's not trying to control things. He's trying to edify and grow people. That's a very different thing. You don't need to follow a leader who wants to control. You want to follow a leader who's working hard to get you to grow and gives you the space to do it. And that means oftentimes when your leader walks in, his bodily presence is weak. Don't make a mistake. That doesn't mean he's powerless, and that doesn't mean he is weak. It means even in his presence, he's giving you space to grow. Or she. They. How about that? Even in their presence, they're giving you space to grow. And they want you to grow. That's a good leader. And that's what we need to be as parents. And that isn't easy. And that's what we need to be as pastors. Not only the elders, but when we pastor one another, that is exactly the way we need to be. And we should be shepherding one another in this flock. We should be stepping up to help our brothers and sisters, guide them and strengthen them. That's not only reserved to the elders, by the way. Okay. 4 he says, we dare not make ourselves of the number or compare ourselves with some that commend themselves, but they measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves are not wise. But we will not boast of things without our measure or outside of our measure. Notice he's measuring carefully. Outside of our measure, but according to the measure of the rule which God hath distributed to us, a measure to reach even unto you. For we stretch not ourselves beyond our measure, as though we reached not unto you. For we are come as far as to you in preaching the gospel of Christ, not boasting of things without our measure or outside of our measure, that is, of other men's labors, but having this hope, when your faith is increased, that we shall be enlarged by you according to our rule abundantly, to preach the gospel in the regions beyond you, and not to boast in another man's line of things made ready to our hands. But he that glorieth, let him glory in the Lord. For not he that commendeth himself is approved, but whom the Lord commendeth. A lot of thoughts, and I'm just going to disassemble them slightly. There's a lot of depth there that we could go into. So I'm just going to take some things lightly. Paul said in the way he follows the Lord is that he follows the Lord after the Spirit. He's not walking according to the flesh, but he's following a set of guidelines or rules that the Lord has laid out for him. One of the rules that the Lord has laid out for him is you cannot go out there, don't go out there and make this about you. It's all about Jesus, not you. And Paul is saying, I want whoever you find in your congregation, in your church in Corinth, whoever's rising up in leadership should live by that same rule. It isn't about them. So that we can actually use you as a launching off place to go out beyond you. But if you guys bring shame to the name of Christ by this selfish form of leadership, by thinking of yourselves more than you ought to, by thinking you're something great because you have the gospel and you have this Bible knowledge and you know how to preach and you've got skills and God is giving blessings by you and he's delivering souls and he's accomplishing things. And so you start thinking of yourself as though you were something, then you're going to fall in pride, and I'm not going to be able to use the Corinthian church as a launching point to go out beyond you. And I want to be able to say, see the Corinthian church, they're following after Christ, and know that it's the case. So I can come to you, and I can go out beyond you, and you haven't already poisoned the well, so to speak. You haven't inoculated the community against the gospel. And I can go to communities who've heard of you, where nobody's preached the gospel, but they don't have a bad report of the gospel, and I can win souls out there. That's what I don't want to come and win souls among you where you've made it ready to my hand. You've already sown and the fruit is already grown up. That's great. You've got harvesters for that. No, I'm the one who goes out and breaks up soil and plants seed and reaps a bounty where nobody's been before. And I want to use you as a launching point. And we in ourselves ought to consider ourselves as being in the position of the Corinthian church. We should hear Paul's instructions to us. And that instruction ought to tell us that we need to be careful that we don't inoculate people around us against the gospel by our behavior. We make it easy for them to hear the gospel because the report they get out of our life is the report of a good person. Not necessarily the stubborn, all-knowing, proud person who claims to be a Christian. And if that's what Christians are like, I don't want any part of it. And that's essentially what that treatise is about. We need to end there. I want to read 2 verses for us before we go. They're in chapter 12. Verse 6 and verse 19. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 6. For though I would desire to glory, I shall not be a fool. For I will say the truth, but now I forbear, lest any man should think of me above that which he seeth me to be, and heareth of me. Paul is deliberately holding back power and authority that he could exercise, and he's doing it for the sake of people who are watching him. And that's the way we need to be. Our thought process should include what other people are going to think when they see us act or hear us speak. Finally, in chapter 12 and verse 19, and again, think ye that we excuse ourselves unto you? We speak before God in Christ, but we do all things, dearly beloved, for your edifying. Final conclusion on the thought process. Paul says, whatever you think we're doing, one thing you need to be assured of, we're not doing it for our profit. When we're now, he built tents for his profit. He had a business that he could profit by. He wasn't looking to profit off the church. And he said, but one thing I want you to know is that I'm not doing this so I can feel good or I can be built up, or you should think of us as though we were this ultra powerful, godly saint that's out there without any of the troubles and tribulations of life. No, that's not us. But what we are doing is everything we do is for your edification, that you might be built up. And if we wanted a final rule for our thinking processes, this would be the rule. The rule would be our thoughts should be thoughts that build others up rather than tearing them down. Let the Holy Spirit have the job of tearing them down. He's really good at it, better than you'll be. And let us have the job of building them up and edifying them. Amen? All right. May the Lord bless your